hoping they're familiar with PCs, because I have their presentation on a USB key, and they have to find it out. This one and this one. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Good evening, everyone. I know everybody is fairly tired at this stage of the day's proceedings. I'd just like to thank Guido for his kind invitation to present to you today. I came to employee share ownership through my trade union, the Unite Trade Union in Ireland, in the banking sector. And I've stayed with employee share ownership since then, and I'm involved in the Irish Profit Sharing Association as chair. But my remarks today are principally as a trade unionist representing workers in the banking sector in the face of the global crisis, and how that has impacted on our employee share ownership plan in the bank. The nature of the Irish employee share ownership plan goes back to the social partnership model that was introduced in our country in the late 1980s. The economy in Ireland in the 1980s was in a fairly weakened and poor state. Very high unemployment, very high levels of emigration, very high levels of government debt. Indeed, in some respects, it's gone back to that today. So the government and trade unions and employers, I think, they grew tired of beating each other up, and they decided that we would be better all going down together than fighting our way to a standstill. So social partnership was introduced. It was based on the Austrian model and possibly the Scandinavian models that were tried after the Second World War. And part of the partnership program over the next 20 to 30 years featured privatization of different companies in banking, in airlines, oil, gas, and telecommunications. Obviously, the trade unions were needed to be persuaded, I should say, that privatization was necessary. And I suppose part of the deal that was struck between the government and the trade unions in respect of the privatization program was that each privatized company would feature an employee share ownership plan. Now, an employee share ownership plan was based pretty much on the original American model. The reason it was attractive to Irish trade unions was it was collective in nature, insofar as the shares were owned collectively on behalf of the group of employees and warehoused in a particular form of ESOP, as it was called, or trust, which I will go into in a while. And that trust had an ability to borrow, which was quite different to other share schemes, which were much more short-term in nature and much more individualistic. The ESOP had a medium to long-term perspective. Our own ESOP in the bank has been on the go now for 10 years. It was controlled by employee representatives, as distinct from the company, was financed also by employees, and involved both employee and leaver beneficiaries. So in other words, you could actually retire and leave the company but retain shares. Other reasons why this model was particularly attractive to trade unions was it generally contained an allowance for the ESOP to appoint one or two directors to the board of the founding company. And in that way it was hoped that the employees would be able to influence the direction and strategic plan of the founding company. Another feature which appealed to trade unionists was the fact that everybody was treated the same, whether you were the managing director or the man who opened the door for the managing director in the morning, you got roughly the same allocation of shares. There was also an allowance for anti-dilution. Initially, the ESOP acquired 14.9% of the founding company, and it was allowed through its trust deed to maintain that level of shareholding if it could afford it. There was a substantial financial reward for employees in certain of the companies, and the overall package certainly helped overcome traditional ideological opposition on the part of unionists in Ireland to the concept of privatisation and market liberalisation and so on and so forth. So they were the reasons why we would have accepted ESOPs, the collectivism, the similar terms, the ability to borrow, and the fact that we controlled the actual plan ourselves as employees. And I'll come back to that aspect in a moment. So what exactly is an ESOP? As I said, it's broadly based on the American ESOP, and it is a fairly common term, but in an Irish context, it's made up of a combination of two separate share schemes. The reason for the two schemes is one trust, the ESOP trust, acquires the shares. And whilst the shares remain in this trust, they are not owned by the individual employees. It's only when they're distributed through the other trust to individual employees that the actual employees gain share ownership rights. So whilst they remain in the first trust can vote those shares as a block. And again, I would point out, as I already have, this was seen as very much a positive thing for trade unions who were interested not just in financial rewards for their members, but also in their ability to influence the strategy of the company going forward. The ESOP structure, and this structure was really originated in our telecommunications company, Eircom, whereby the employees, in return for agreeing to a fairly significant number of changes to their work practices, were given a 5% stake in the company, and then they went out and borrowed to acquire a further 9.9% stake. So in that way they were able to acquire 14.9% of what was a fairly major company in Ireland at the time. It would have had in excess of 14,000 employees. And as you can see on the screen, the ESOP acquires the shares, and over time, for tax reasons, They are held initially in the ESOP, then they're moved into the approved profit sharing scheme for distribution to individual beneficiaries who it was theorized would make substantial financial awards when they eventually received those shares after a minimum of 3 years. And obviously each year there would be a limit on the tax effectiveness of the share award. In terms of the transformation practices that would have been commonly agreed for the 5%, for example, you would have had terms such as an increased working week agreed, the ability for the company to outsource without trade union opposition, agreement on a voluntary redundancy program, and in our case within the bank, transfers all around the bank as needed by the bank, so that you wouldn't have to get into a negotiation every time a particular department closed down or whatever. A closer linking of performance and reward, continuation of staff flexibility, and no cost increasing claims for at least 3 years. And obviously cooperation with the integration of the bank into a new ownership situation. As we were then a state industrial bank, a state business bank, we were being bought over by Bank of Scotland, so it was obviously very important that we would be seen to be cooperating with this change of ownership. In terms of the acquisition of the 9.9% in our bank, we achieved this by way of loan, by way of an agreement to contribute to our staff pensions, 5% of pensionable salary. And again, because the increase in working hours was significant, we were able to use it on the one hand to gain 5% and on the other to contribute towards the acquisition of 9.9%. And finally, a 3-year profit share agreement. And in that way, we were able to acquire 9.9% of the Irish State Bank. Now, I have to emphasize 14.9% of the Irish State Bank, soon reduced very drastically once we were taken over to less than, quite considerably less than 1% of the Bank of Scotland. So by Mark's terms, obviously our significance as a voting bloc in this scenario was diminished considerably and significantly. In terms of issues that we would have had in our negotiations and in planning our strategy as a trade union committee in the bank, we obviously had to balance the financial and the strategic objectives. Now, given the fact that our shareholding was going to reduce from 14.9% to less than 1%, you can imagine that most members concentrated on the financial, because they reckoned as a very small shareholder we would have no influence over the direction or strategy of the Bank of Scotland, and indeed they were quite correct. So we fell down on the financial, whereas in the telecommunications company they still held on to their 14.9% and indeed increased it over the years, so that they were very effective in terms of influencing certain aspects of board policy going forward. And we would have also seen it with our airline company, Aer Lingus, where Ryanair, the low-cost airline in Ireland, which is virulently anti-trade union, wanted to take over Aer Lingus. Well, the ESOP in Aer Lingus contributed to blocking that takeover attempt, because, as I say, the shares were held as a block and voted as a block. So in terms of strategic importance, some of these ESOPs were very successful. The trust deed, which has to be negotiated at the outset, indeed involves quite lengthy negotiations between lawyers on behalf of the staff, lawyers on behalf of the company, and lawyers on behalf of the government, is the document by which the assets are managed. And as you can imagine, and I go on to talk about this, there are certain conflicts of interest on the board of any ESOP because the trade union obviously likes to have its people on the board, the company likes to have its people on the board, and then you would generally have one so-called independent professional director. So obviously on the board of any ESOP, and our chairman is down there, Brendan, it's very important to recognise conflict as it arrives and manage it. And I would have to say, with the exception of the last year, most of our board meetings were highly, highly cooperative, highly amiable affairs, but I'm afraid the global crisis put the board under severe pressure at times, and it took all of Brendan's skills to drag us through that crisis. So, and again, within the beneficiaries, you will have different classes because employees have different interests to leavers. Under an Irish ESOP, only an employee can increase their shareholding in a tax-effective manner, and they can retain that shareholding for longer than a leaver. So sometimes you would get conflicts there as well, so they have to be dealt with. So a typical trustee company board, which looks after the block of shares, would typically have 4 elected or nominated employee reps. As it happens in our particular ESOP, the 4 employee reps are nominated by the trade union. Then you would have 2 board members who are nominated by the founding company, which would be Bank of Scotland Ireland at this stage. And then, as I say, we would have 1 corporate lawyer who would be the independent professional director. The management is delegated to the secretary with the trustee company duties. They're very clearly set out in advance in legal documents. So the role of the ESOP trustee board, as I said, Brendan would be chair and I'm a director, is to act in the best interests of beneficiaries at all times, using that similar terms concept where everybody has a similar and equal right. It has a duty to secure and protect the trust assets, i.e. the shares. Now, we are a captive investor, we are a long-term investor, which in our case came back to haunt us in the global crisis. In our case, we didn't have company board representation because it simply wasn't an offer that was made to us. It would have been had we stayed a 14.9% shareholder. But as a shareholder with a shareholding of less than 1%, that was never really a practical proposal. So in other ESOPs in Ireland, you will have at least 1, if not 2 directors on the founding company's board. But in our case, we did not have any directors on the Bank of Scotland Ireland board. Just just to conclude on that corporate governance piece, I would say because shares are owned collectively within an ESOP, and the ESOPs in Eircom, in Aer Lingus, and in the electricity generating company, the ESB, have been very successful in protecting certain of the interests of the employees. Eircom, for example, now, the Eircom ESOP now owns about 30% of the share capital of the company. Aer Lingus, I think it's about 12.5%, and the ESB 5%. Now the ESB has yet to be privatised. The unions in the ESB are very, very strong, so it remains to be seen whether it will be privatised, to be honest with you. But these ESOPs, they have been highly influential in blocking unwelcome takeovers, certainly in the case of Aer Lingus, and against the breakup of the ESB. I would just make one passing reference to Eircom, and that is that the privatisation would not be viewed as a non-qualified success in Ireland. Eircom's ownership has changed hands 4 times since it's been privatised, and it has become, how should I say, the plaything of hedge funds to some degree. Now the ESOP has protected the assets of the beneficiaries by increasing its shareholding each time the ownership has changed hands. But unfortunately, because the ownership has changed hands, because the company is now saddled with huge debts, there is no proper infrastructural investment going on through this company. And as a result, the privatization has been seen publicly to be a bit of a failure, and people would then question, of course, why the employees